Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Fair Tech Forum Day 1. My name is Andy Hyman. I'm your esteemed moderator for today. I join you from Washington, D.C., where I work for an organization called Monument Advocacy. So I approach a lot of the issues we're talking about today from a U.S. business perspective. And I'll be facilitating the conversation today with our three guests. Christian, I'll kick it over to you for first your introduction, and then please start with 3 to 5 minutes of your opening remarks.
Thank you, Andy. So thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I'm heading up the European office of the Computer and Communications Industry Association, CCA, which represents a range of EU and US technology companies. And of course, we, like everybody else, look very much forward to the EU-US summit tomorrow. As allies, as trading partners, as friends, we can hopefully declare that the transatlantic partnership is back. And this new Trade and Technology Council that is expected to be announced tomorrow, we think this TTC is an opportunity to better address the steady stream of irritants, which are normal among friends, of course, but which simply needs to be managed much better going forward. There's a number of areas where the EU and US can immediately cooperate, and I would like to mention just two of them. First of all, countries should agree to drop unilateral taxes and instead lead efforts to achieve global tax reform this year. And secondly, they should stop the rise of data flow restrictions and instead agree on a strengthened transatlantic framework for commercial data flows. But we also need to have a more honest conversation about the proposals, those proposals that are more about pursuing tech sovereignty or industrial policy rather than more legitimate goals. Take, for instance, the EU's Digital Markets Act, the DMA. There are 10,000 platforms in Europe, yet the DMA targets only a few US companies. It is, moreover, a fairly blunt regulatory experiment that also risks doing unattended damage to Europe's digitizing economy. We hope the final Digital Markets Act will be proportionate, evidence-based, and fair. I'll be very happy to go into more details, but I think I'll stop here, and I'm eager to hear my other fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Appreciate the remarks. Isabel, over to you for an introduction of yourself and an introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Anderson, and good to be with you all today. So I work with BSA, the Software Alliance. We are a global organization that represents the enterprise software industry. So we have operations in about 30 countries across APAC, Europe, and the Americas. And essentially, our members are enabling their customers to go through digital transformation and to operate more efficiently in a digitalized world. So among our priorities, be it around data privacy, cybersecurity, or emerging tech or digital trade, a lot of what we do is trying to drive convergence of rules. And so totally agree with Christian in sort of looking at the EU-US partnership and fully get it a new start. We think the partnership can be a real driver of convergence and interoperability. The relationship is important on a lot of different levels, but also for its implications on the world stage. Today, a lot of countries are looking at betting on digital transformation, first of all, as a way to boost their recovery from COVID, among others. And many are really looking at what kind of rules make sense and do they want for a digital sector and how to address these different facets. And so the real challenge perhaps is around how do we accommodate those public policy objectives that indeed may vary across jurisdictions, all the while responding to this need for convergence, because we are living in a globalized economy, because it's inherently digital and it's growing inherently digital. I think today we expect about 60% of the global GDP to be digitalized. And this was predictions pre-COVID, so anticipating that number might even be bigger today. And so again, I think the partnership can be a driver for global conversation on those rules of the road and hopefully bringing others along the way to make this impetus more meaningful as well. And so we see perhaps a few areas where convergence and partnership should happen and can happen. One, I again concur with Christian on the data flows aspect and enabling international data flows. And I think I would add specifically looking at government access to data as well, as we see that this is really an area where increasingly challenges are happening. And perhaps naming just a few other areas, artificial intelligence is also an area that both the EU and US are contemplating regulating. And so looking at what governance makes sense and how to do that together to us makes a lot of sense. Cybersecurity is also an area where, it's a team sport. And so cooperation makes a lot of sense, incentivizing cooperation and ensuring that we have again, common standards, common rules will help that cooperation. And then finally, I think the EU and the US can be facing the same kind of market access issues in third countries, be it on data localization requirements or distortive technological mandates and standards. And so those could be areas that indeed a partnership could help address. So I'll stop there, but again, happy to go deeper into some of these later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabel. I really like the discussion around convergences and places to find agreement here. Alec, over to you for an introduction of yourself and your introductory remarks.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me today. My name is Alex Sapp. I'm the Director of Technology Policy at the Progressive Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. We are a moderate center-left think tank that works on a wide variety of issues from education, healthcare, budgeting, and our strongest area is tech and innovation, which we've worked on for decades now. And our slogan is we're radically pragmatic. And so we work with some of the most moderate members in the House of Representatives, so the new Democrat caucus, our close friends, and then the most moderate members of the Senate as well as in the Biden administration. And so, today I know that the headline of this event is Biden versus the EU, but kind of like Isabel said, I want to talk about, opportunities for convergence or overlap, because I think there's definitely more that unites us than divides us. And I think this is a great time for a reset post-Trump and to kind of remember that. And also with the rise of authoritarianism around the world, most importantly in China, it's important to remember that, we need to collectively work together to set the rules of the road internationally and to present a united front to countries that are anti-democratic or opposed to liberal values. And so I'll just briefly, in my opening remarks, touch on a few areas I think are worthy of discussion or relevant to this debate. So as Isabel mentioned on the privacy issue, in the short run, we're definitely optimistic that through executive action, we can solve the problems with US-EU privacy shields and, continue having transatlantic data flows, which are so essential to digital trade. We also like the way that the OECD global minimum tax conversation is progressing. That makes much more sense, in our opinion, than digital services taxes that are country-specific, targeted at just one or two companies. And we want broad rules that apply to kind of all multinationals that set kind of a floor on taxes. So that's much needed reform. That's a great move for partnership. And then in terms of trade deals in general, obviously the having trade wars with your allies did not work well in the Trump administration. It made it harder to put trade pressure on countries like China. And so we are very excited for reopening discussions about new trade deals between the US and the EU. Rumors of a US-EU Trade and Tech Council are very welcome. And hopefully that could go in the direction of something like TTIP we saw with the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Just increasing trade between our two regions would be highly welcome. And then just a few other areas I'll touch on. Competition is an issue area I work on a lot. Obviously, the Digital Markets Act is in progress. Last Friday, some Democrats in the House Judiciary Committee, along with a few Republicans, released a slew of antitrust bills targeting specific US tech companies, 4 or 5 in particular. And that's obviously highly reminiscent of the Digital Markets Act approach to regulation. And I think that's not the best way to approach things. Having arbitrary market cap thresholds of, in this case, in the US side, $600 billion in market cap. It doesn't appear obvious to me why you should have different rules for large American tech companies rather than large Chinese tech companies, why it would make sense to hobble American companies at this point in time when we're trying to win a technological race with China. And so I don't think that these views are nearly as mainstream in the US as they are in the EU in terms of how to treat large technology companies, but there is growing sentiment in that sense as well. And so we hope that the Biden administration and our partners in the EU can find another way forward to increase transparency and rules of the road digitally, but that don't attack, particular companies disproportionately.
Thank you very much, Alec. I certainly agree. And I think a really interesting point of discussion for today is going to need to be the intersection between technology, trade, and tax. And I think that focusing on those three really kind of makes sense. So let's start and let's kind of dive down this tax rabbit hole here. Alec and Christian, whoever would like to go first, where do you see the tax situation flowing now that we're in a massive COVID recovery situation? The international tax system is very different than it was a year ago and very different than it certainly was at the beginning of the BEPS process. So now that we're seeing, economies begin to recover, folks are beginning to emerge into a post-COVID world, where do you see the tax conversation going in response to that instead of maybe, or how has the trajectory changed over the last 6 months on taxes?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. You said the tax situation has changed a lot the last 6 months as well. I think I think the problem is the world has changed a lot since the current tax rule was put in place. And it's almost 100 years ago, right? I mean, today we have multinationals. A lot of trade is in services. It's in intangibles. Most companies doing business, they don't have any physical operations in a country, which normally kicks in taxation locally. So I can totally understand the frustrations of countries saying, well, all these different types of companies are doing business in my country, but they have no physical presence, so I cannot tax them. I can totally understand that countries like France are frustrated, and then they start taxing other countries' multinationals. And then other countries start taxing their multinationals, right? And then again into this tit for tat, this where tax disputes become trade disputes. And this is happening more and more often. And, the good news is, of course, that the OECD and with this mandate from the G20 economies have really been ramping up their work in the last few years. And there's been a lot of momentum now with the new Biden administration, with their proposal for a global minimum tax, and also with a reallocation of taxing rights for the biggest multinationals. And the proposal is not singling out specific sectors. This is the biggest multinationals that will have to pay more taxes locally. I think, of course, many members will probably have to pay more locally, but taken as a whole, we think that this leadership shown by the G7 just a few days ago, by G20, and by actually the whole 139 countries who are involved in this global exercise is very, very positive. And we are very supportive of efforts towards this global tax reform. And of course, even if you have to pay more, it is worth it, because you will get into a global system. You'll have a durable system, hopefully will be in place for decades to come, and you will have this stability. And I think that is certainly worth applauding. So we hope there will be a global ambitious tax deal sometime this year.
Yeah, and I'll just add on top of that, because I think that Chris made some good points about how the world has changed, the global economies have changed, and so therefore it's time for tax rules to change. And all I'll just say is that the direction they change, I think I want to see them treat both digital, offline versus online companies the same. And so, if a company has revenues in foreign countries, so basing taxes proportionate to sales, I'm open to solutions like that if they don't have actual physical offices in certain places. But I would just be careful, and I'll echo these comments later. I'm sure you'll hear me talk about with competition rules and with privacy rules. It makes no sense to me to apply one set of rules to digital companies and to tech companies and a whole different set of rules to other companies. Most businesses today use technology in some fashion. They use cloud technology, they use software, they use the internet. And so all companies are mixed. They're becoming more mixed over time. And so if we wrote the rules of the road for only digital companies today, that would just make things harder in the future. We need to rewrite them again. And so let's write them once consistently now, and then we won't have to reform them for a good bit of time.
And if I may add, I think I absolutely agree. One point of having this global consensus is to avoid having every country doing their own unilateral discriminatory taxes. So of course there is this expectation, and there should be a commitment that countries right away remove their unilateral discriminatory taxes, right? Could be a digital tax, for instance. And I mean, I think we're very close to having this global consensus. It could already be next month, and when the G20 economies meet. I think now would be a good time for France and these other countries that have digital taxes in place, that they drop them now, at least suspend them or do something just to show goodwill and say, okay, let's take this over the finishing line. It is a little bit curious that the European Commission is slated to put forward a digital levy, not a digital tax like they dropped a few years ago, but a digital levy. I mean, this sounds like the things we're trying to avoid by having a global tax deal. So it's a bit odd that the Commission is putting forward a digital levy, but I mean, I haven't seen it yet. We'll have to see how it looks like.
So positivity from you, Christian, which I certainly appreciate in this conversation around conflicts and convergences. Alec, from you, a recognition, and while there's positivity there, you're hopeful that there's a way to treat digital and infrastructure or physical goods kind of the same. So, Alec, the arguments against that position could be, relatively worn. How would you respond to someone who says that's absolutely not true? Digital is different. There's so much of our lives are digital. It shouldn't be the case that we've got the same systems for digital and physical at this point in time.
Yeah, what I would say is that, one, I think that digital people often talk about network effects and the economies of scale, but economies of scale operate in lots of different markets. And so I'll just go back to the proposed bills in the U.S. because I've been knee deep in them for the last few days thinking about these set of 5 bills. And again, they're pretty similar to a proposed Digital Markets Act in the EU. The most extreme of which would be a line of business restriction on a covered designated platform. And again, they're writing the filters in a way that the only designated platforms could be large companies like Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook. And the line of business restriction would be the most extreme remedy in all 5 of these proposed bills. And effectively, that would say that if you own any kind of platform, you can't compete on top of it in any way. And if you have heard Elizabeth Warren give speeches in the last few years, you're obviously familiar with her. You can't, baseball analogy, if you can't be an umpire and have a team in the game at the same time, there's kind of an irreconcilable conflict of interest, which sounds intuitive in terms of fairness until you start thinking about it a little more and you realize that, well, every feature of a platform has potential functionality that could be done by a third party. And so anything the platform does, not just the obvious, like selling goods and services on an e-commerce platform, but any features, like so down to the nitty gritty in terms of like the flashlight button on your smartphone device. The smartphones didn't ship with a flashlight button. They used to be third-party apps. And then Google and Apple integrated the flashlight feature just into the settings panel. Is that illegal now? How do you enforce these things? You really have to get into like very minute enforcement decisions of like user interface and user experience that I think enforcement officials are not well placed to conduct. And then in terms to your point about like digital and physical not being different, I mean, Walmart is a $400 billion company in the US. They would fall under the market cap threshold here, but they have a marketplace online just like Amazon does, though much smaller, of course, with third parties. And they have a huge, much bigger private label goods business than Amazon does. And they use tons of store data to pick out the best products that will, customers will love and they can undercut the name brand stuff. And they use, sales data, third-party data from data brokers, and then they put them on shelves right next to the name brand stuff and they sell a lot of it. And so it just seems illogical to me to think that the digital realm is different enough that you could ban that kind of activity when Amazon does it, but it's not a problem when Walmart does it. And if people want to say that, store brand goods are bad all around and CVS shouldn't be able to do it, Kroger shouldn't be able to do it, Walmart shouldn't be able to do it, we can have that argument, but no one wants to make that argument because it's relatively absurd.
Understood. I think that it is easier to talk about things when you really are comparing apples to apples, which I think may be a good segue to talking about transatlantic data flows. Something that's near and dear to all of our hearts here is the Privacy Shield agreement and data adequacy determination for the United States. Isabel, you started off in your remarks talking a lot about convergence and places where we might be able to find common ground. Christian has talked a little bit about taxes and the positivity there. Alec has talked a little bit about how the differentiation between competition policy goes. Isabel, how do you see the next period of time going on transatlantic data flows, and how do we get to an agreement there, or how could you see the situation playing out?
Thank you. That's a great question and not an easy one. So thank you for that. So I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic and positive. I think there is compared to where we were a few years ago, there's a recognition, I think, that data flows, first of all, is not a tech issue, a digital industry issue. It's a valid across sector and across jurisdictions. And that changes a lot how the discussion is framed. And that's already a very important part. I think the problem definition is an important element there. We see data flows are on the agenda of a lot of summits and sort of multilateral discussions. The G7 communique over the weekend was another example of that. There's very promising negotiations at the WTO with the Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce. So there is a lot of impetus to address that problem. Then looking at the EU specifically, obviously, we're very eager to see a new Privacy Shield agreement. I think the urgency there is real. Privacy Shield was an important transfer mechanism for a lot of organizations, not only companies and certainly not only big tech companies, as it has been portrayed at times. It's also reflective of some of the challenges, perhaps, that are associated with the adequacy model. And it reflects the need that there needs to be organizations that need to transfer data for legitimate purposes and with sort of responsible safeguards in place, need to have options. And so I think the common question to a lot of those different elements is really, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's less and less about how this works out in the commercial area. I think there's a lot of rules in place that are clarifying the responsibilities of the different actors. There's sort of informants mechanism, etc. Increasingly, we see again that question being posed in the government access problem. And I think the reason to be optimistic there is that we see that this is at least making it on the agenda of folks. There's good conversations going on at the OECD. The challenge there will be, of course, of how do we actually operationalize what's going to be, if something is agreed, how do we operationalize that? And that's true also for discussions in the G7 context. But again, I think that's a good reminder of, in the EU-US context, there's a lot that those two economic partners share. And so there might be indeed sort of irritants that take us away from that focus. But so zooming back in on the commonalities, I think is really important. If you go back to the roots, both jurisdictions are really using the OECD privacy principles, which are a set of 10 or 12, I don't remember, of principles that are common. The way to interpret them might be slightly different. The way to, again, translate them into practice may be a bit different, but that's not to say that there cannot be interoperability between the systems. And I think that's really where we want to go and where we're going to get. I mentioned at the beginning also that it is certainly important in the EU-US context, because that can really be, I think, a broader impetus to sort of bringing others, like-minded partners, perhaps at the beginning, but also the idea is to have, the more the merrier. Economic reality is that adequacies, decisions in the EU context, we have about a dozen of those. We need to have stable, sustainable transfer mechanisms that we can operate with 160 plus countries around the world. So those are sort of considerations that I think need to be looked at pragmatically. And again, it's not about getting one solution, it's about getting a set of solutions. But again, Privacy Shield has this symbolic value as well that certainly would go a long way in sort of getting this new partnership in the right place to build towards perhaps other things. Trade agreement, like was mentioned earlier, might be then in the realm of possible if we do get those first steps right. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. The way I think about it often has to deal with, and as an American, I'm fully not as cognizant as all of you, as the nature of the adequacy determination and how the tension between an adequacy determination between the EU and the US right now, especially in a time of attempts at cooperation, stands in the way of cooperation or potentially stands in the way of other cooperation on other bigger picture issues, climate change, major foreign policy issues. And it's interesting to me how you describe a good multilateral framework, or how a data adequacy determination may not work at a one-to-one scale. Do you have any further thoughts on how an adequacy, or what would a post-adequacy determination world look like, if you have any ideas there? How you could bridge the gap between the current structure and something like a trade agreement or a multilateral data sharing agreement that we're already seeing at the OECD? Easy question, I know.
Another easy question. Thank you, Anderson. That's a really tough one. I think I'll say that one thing that we would not want to see, and that sort of builds a little bit on what was said earlier about digital tax, is this idea of fragmentation. I think when it comes to privacy, it's very important to have a clear set of principles in place, but also, again, for organizations to have a clear sense of what is allowed, and that allows them to not only respond to their needs of today, but potentially their needs as a business, as an organization on the longer term. So I think the future-proofness, in a way, is an important criteria in this. What we see in terms of data localization trends is that it's popping up here and there. I think it's less about their format and more about the substance. What is the result that we want to achieve collectively? And I think given the state of the discussions that we've seen again at G7 or in the WTO, maybe we're not quite there yet, or there's not yet a common understanding of what the objective is. And so I think that's where also sort of the business community, but also civil society and other groups that have a stake in that can really help, I think, also paint a picture and explain what are some of the unintended consequences that we may see with certain given approaches. And I think that's sort of where we can play a role collectively in helping policymakers and governments around the world to again make sense of what's the most logical way forward, and again, how do we get to where we want to go. But others may have more insightful views as well on that.
Yeah, this is one of the biggest questions for me in EU-US tech. What are these intermediary steps we take between adequacy determinations until like a durable long-term agreement? Christian, I don't know if you had any thoughts there that might build off of Isabel.
Yeah, maybe just to follow up, I think I absolutely agree with Isabel that the short term, hopefully, will be an adequacy agreement between the EU and the US. That will be doable and sort of Schrems proof, right? And then longer term, I mean, what we need to be cognizant about is that we are seeing more and more third countries that are requiring data to be stored locally. These data localization requirements that is not data protection. That is data protectionism, right? And I think the only way to really address that is for the EU and US and other like-minded countries is to get together and figure out how do we ensure that you can have data protection but avoid data protectionism, and that you can do in a trade agreement. And this is not, I mean, people say, but this is new, we're selling out privacy. What are you talking about? This has been in place since the mid-90s, right? You already have data flows and respect for privacy in the current trade framework, but I think you want to tighten it a little bit just to make sure that third countries don't use it as an excuse for data protectionism.
If I could just add a follow-up there, I think that I'll try to do a little prognostication here, which is always risky. But I think what we're going to see is that because the legislative process in the US is too slow and there are too many other priorities, there's no chance, in my mind, a very, very, very low chance there'll be any kind of data privacy legislation that could impact the Schrems II decision. And so therefore, we're going to need to see a lot of the action on the executive side, where the Biden administration needs to decide what they're willing to do on national security surveillance issues to kind of reach that adequacy decision from the EU. And I think conversely, the EU needs to recognize that should interpret generously whatever actions the Biden administration does take, just because a lot of EU member states engage in similar levels of surveillance that is currently exempt from the EU's remit. And so it's a tough position to put a foreign country in to demand higher standards from them than you do of some countries, member states. And so I think that in this case, there'll be some changes at the executive level. There needs to be good faith on the side of the EU to recognize that those are substantive changes and meet an adequacy requirement. And then we'll probably be back in the same boat in a few years to see what the European courts say in terms of, is that adequacy adjudication sufficient? And I understand that the EU is in a tough position as well, because the Commission wants to make sure that the actions they take are upheld by the courts in the long run, just so they have their own legitimacy as a decision-making body. But I think that's the kind of how I see these things playing out. I don't see legislation fixing this. Hopefully some moderate executive action happens, but there needs to be recognition on both sides that you can't ask too much of a foreign country that you don't ask of your own member states.
And look at the UK, right? As long as you're in the EU club, free flow of personal data, no problem. The day you leave when the clock strikes midnight, suddenly, are you adequate? So, we better hope that France doesn't leave the EU project, because then they would have to be scrutinized the same way that the EU scrutinizes other third countries like the UK now and the US.
Can I add something on the UK adequacy, which is, I think it's interesting as well to see, and I agree with the premise that the European Commission is also bound by what the court has said, and so their margin of maneuver is that needs to answer the court's ruling from last July. I think what's interesting in the draft UK adequacy on the commercial side is that we can see that the Commission has really tried to be very creative in bringing new things into its adequacy model to try and get to that point where hopefully it's going to stick to the court's ruling as well. The reference to the European Court of Human Rights is a good example. It doesn't maybe answer all the concerns and other sort of perceived shortcomings that might be still at play, but I think it's interesting to see the Commission really getting to, again, try to be creative and constructive, at least in those discussions, but agree, it takes two to tango as well.
Yes, and as somebody who works on the ground in Washington, D.C. every day, I will agree wholeheartedly with Mr. Stapp about the difficulty of legislation. It's hard to change a comma in Congress right now. So appreciate that point, certainly. I think that we could have a very interesting discussion for the next hour about data flows, but let's switch back a little bit to competition and the Digital Markets Act. Christian, do you have a view on the regulatory framework employed by the DMA, especially vice US structures, in case you have it, or maybe Alec, that's something that you can build on after that you've already touched on a little bit?
I'm sure to have first go on the EU side. So for our association, we're very interested in competition policy, because that's sort of the purpose of our organization when it was founded nearly 50 years ago, to ensure that all competitors in the market have a fair chance to succeed on their merits. What we want to ensure is that the final DMA legislation is proportionate, evidence-based, and fair. The DMA is a very blunt instrument. It sets out 18 mandatory obligations and prohibitions on the so-called gatekeeper platforms. But this one-size-fits-all approach doesn't really make sense for the very different companies that are being targeted. Some are, in retail, some are in social networking, some in search, some operate app stores, etc. So it's very different business models. The equivalent would be that if you went to the dentist, with a toothache, and then your dentist, as a precaution measure, immediately removes 18 teeth. The DMA assumes that these 18 forms of conduct are always harmful in all circumstances, while ignoring the potential positive effects for users and consumers, right? So a more proportionate approach would be for the European Commission to specify which obligations are relevant for the specific gatekeeper company. And this can be done fairly quickly in the very beginning and can be tailored following further regulatory dialogue, as already envisaged in the Commission's proposal. This is a minor fix that would help ensure that the DMA would meet its stated goals while avoiding some of the unintended consequences.
As somebody that's less familiar with the DMA, could you give an example about how that minor fix or how you're thinking through enumerating those harms might work?
Yeah, so some of these remedies they didn't come out of the blue, right? Some of them come from existing competition enforcement cases, and I think that's been something like maybe 30 European competition antitrust cases or investigations in the last 5 years. So there's been quite a lot. But you can see some of them are more aimed at e-commerce, some are more aimed at other business models. So it doesn't really make sense to take the remedies from one business model and just apply them to everybody, right? You probably want the Commission say, well, it was actually intended for this type of business model, and then say, so therefore it applies only to your type of business model.
Right, tying it more clearly between the business model and the enforcement action. That makes sense. Sorry, Alec, didn't mean to interrupt. Over to you.
No, yeah, that's actually helpful as a springboard for my comments. And I think, looking at the particular problems in an industry or sector or market is the better way to do it than broadly defining just large companies that, again, like Walmart, if it grows by $200 billion, could arguably fall under this new antitrust bill, one of these slew of antitrust bills in the United States. And then all of a sudden, if you were targeting tech companies now, are you going to regulate Walmart in the same way? So I think in this case, like, for example, I'll just use social media as one example. One of the 5 bills introduced last week in the US, that again are similar in goal and scope to Digital Markets Act in the EU, is about data portability and interoperability. I think there are good ways to do that and bad ways to do that. So in the US, there's basically universal agreement that in the telecom sector, telephone number portability was a pro-competitive, pro-consumer regulatory change, right? So it lowered switching costs for users. I own my telephone number. I can take it between Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile. And there's not actually a disincentive to investment. That's the main thing we should be concerned about, because if you operate a telecom company, whether you own the telephone number or the consumer does, you have to assign a number to a user, to a consumer to operate in that market. And so there's not really concern that like companies would say, hey, now that this is portable, I'm no longer going to invest in the systems, infrastructure, and platforms to collect this data, harvest it, and process it, and deploy it. And so that gets the right trade-off, I think, between investment incentives and data portability. And so that could happen appropriately within one of these bills. We'll see how it actually gets implemented. And to my example about social media, what's a static equivalent, a static discrete piece of information that's similar to telephone number portability? I think the social graph on social networks is similar. That's like the list of your connections between different people. It's similar to the idea of like whenever currently you download a new social media app, often it asks you for access to your contacts list from your phone, because that's an easy way to just automatically find all your friends that are on the platform. And you one click, like actually have a graph of people in a new place. And that makes competition a lot easier. And so mandating that from the top could be great. And I don't think it would actually decrease incentives to invest, because to operate a platform like that, you have to have a social graph of some kind, though they can differ on specifics. I get more concerned when you get into interoperability type mandates, where then maybe you're actually locking in the old way of doing things. If every new platform has to interoperate with Facebook in the year 2021, the next 10 years, are we actually going to get stagnation because the current way of doing things gets locked in? So there are good ways and bad ways of doing it, but you have to think like, what are the particular problems in social media? What are the actual remedies that can make this better? And I think data portability and social graph portability is one of those ways to do it.
Interesting point. Thanks, Alec. I think that one of your points has been throughout the conversation today about future proofing and about long-term proposals that can create a regulatory environment for business that they're able to invest and see returns. And I think a big picture piece of maybe cooperation could be around artificial intelligence, AI, machine learning. On the United States side, we've seen an increase in administration leadership. I mean, not to say that the previous administration didn't have AI proposals as well, but we've seen a pivot from the Biden administration to prioritizing this, especially at the OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology policy. Isabel, on AI, do you think that this could be a piece where the EU could start adopting some of the US proposals, the US adopts some of the EU proposals? How do you see the interaction there working? And where do you see the differences in kind of democratic values or civil rights or human rights fitting in the differences between the two countries?
Yeah, thank you. Easier question perhaps this time. I think it's definitely an area where there's room for convergence, and where again it makes sense to have the EU and US putting their heads together in defining what kind of governance makes sense for AI. What we've seen coming out from the EU proposal a few weeks ago, I think answers to a lot of the concerns regarding the future-proofness indeed, but also the fact that AI means a lot of different things depending on which context it's used in, what kind of purpose, how it's developed. And so this is typically an area where I think Alec was making that point earlier, where you can't sort of draw with legislation with big brush. It wouldn't work, and it might have unintended consequences. I think AI is offering incredible opportunities, and we see that across the board from sort of economic growth or healthcare and such. But there are some pretty consequential impacts also on people's lives. And so it's absolutely important to address those aspects that will inform the way we trust that type of technology, we collectively, whether it's in the consumer phase, whether it's in the B2B space as well, where the things might be presented slightly differently. But I think the focus that the Commission choose to put forward on high-risk AI and focusing on that makes a lot of sense. And indeed, we see that there's an interest on both sides of the Atlantic to look at AI and, again, what kind of convergence makes sense. We, as BSA, we're definitely eager to be informing that conversation, because we think it's important to address some of the concerns head on. One of the concerns when we talk about AI and machine learning is often around bias. How do you prevent bias in all its forms from being in a system? And one of the challenges with AI is really that it is not a fixed picture in time. It's AI is something that has a real life cycle to it, from development to deployment. And so to us, it's extremely important to have a risk management approach when looking at, again, preventing bias in a given AI system. So I'm going to do a bit of self-promotion, because we actually put out a few days ago and a framework on preventing bias, and it's offering a methodology to look at different steps of the AI life cycle. And each of those steps, there are risk management approaches that can be taken to ensure that we mitigate that risk. I'm mentioning that because it's an interesting one, but also because it's typically one area where there is a lot of convergence. You were talking about values. Those are typically where the EU and the US share an awful lot. And this is where, again, it's to initiate those conversations and to look at a common picture on governance. And so having a globally harmonized approach is the natural next steps as well on this. So that's something that we would certainly appreciate seeing maybe as an outcome of the summit tomorrow, to see a nudge to this need for AI cooperation to, again, set the right convergence to mitigate some of the risks, but also to ensure that we can really take advantage of all the opportunities that lie in with AI and machine learning.
Yeah, and if I could just add on to that real quick, because I think that I appreciate that Isabel mentioned how there's a lot of overlap in values and how there needs to be some regulation in this area to improve secure AI governance. I do want to see a harmonization there as well. I think if that's the regulatory question, I think on the public investment and R&D side, you can achieve a lot of the same goals as well, and we shouldn't underrate that. Thinking of a great paper I saw last year from the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown here in the US. It's titled Shaping the Terrain of AI Competition, and talks about how using public investment in research and development in the AI space, you can kind of shift the way the technology develops in the future towards more liberal democratic values and being as opposed to authoritarian values. And so just to take one example, obviously there's currently the perception, at least, that China has an advantage in some types of machine learning and artificial intelligence because they don't have any real substantive data protection or data privacy rules in place. And so the companies there can harvest tons of Chinese user data and maybe advance more quickly. And so the kind of public investment solution in this case would be for the US, the EU, and other liberal democratic countries to invest in certain types of artificial intelligence technology, like one-shot learning and like simulation learning, that don't depend on having massive troves of user data. So that way it's compatible with protecting user privacy. You still get advancements in AI, but you're shaping the terrain of AI competition for the future in a way that's more compatible with liberal democracies. And so I think thinking critically about public investment in that way is also a potential avenue for cooperation and collaboration.
Quickly, we talk about values in technologies, and I think for everybody it's very clear that AI is great potential, but can really be misused. I think some of the uses of AI that we're seeing in non-democracies, it's just scary, right? I mean, even us who work in technology, I think that's just not the type of technology enablement that we want to see. So I definitely agree that AI is an obvious place for the EU and US to start, and something that could be part of the TTC conversation. I think the EU's approach is, frankly, I think it's probably too much red tape. It's pretty heavy for sort of US lawmakers, and that's fine. But I think it's, frankly, the EU is very eager to be sort of leader in regulation, but it's not so eager to be a leader in innovation. And I think AI is probably a good example of that. That said, I think in the Commission's proposal, it takes this very risk-based approach, right? And it takes this dual focus on both, trying to make sure that people actually trust AI, because frankly, else people are not going to want to take it up and use it in Europe, but also enable AI at the same time. So that's a nice dual approach. That's a very good starting point for transatlantic conversation.
Yeah, I guess as a Democrat, I'm not sure I'd agree with you about the U.S. regulations and red tape. I mean, there is no amount of red tape that we have not been in favor of. So hopefully we'll see some progress there moving forward. You mentioned the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, or whatever it ends up being called in its final iteration. I think a lot of this is still speculation, and I think a lot of what we're talking about today may fit in there, and that could be a focal point for it. And this is a little bit outside of the scope of this conversation, but I'm interested into how you see the broader either agreements on non-digital trade issues, on steel, aluminum, traditional trade issues intersecting with the tech issues here. So how can a TTC or whatever it's going to be called function when it's trying to discuss both issues at once? Or is that the natural way to do it? Must you always discuss data flows and AI and export control at the same time as steel and aluminum and workers' rights? I think it's an open question for me, so I'd love to hear what you guys think about it.
I'll take the first stab. I think that I do like having these things kind of all one package, because I think it's realizing that, again, like, if we're going to counter the rise of authoritarianism in other countries, we need to work together as partners. That doesn't mean doing it just on digital issues or just on physical goods and services. It's doing it all at the same time and realizing that we have a lot more in common than we sometimes think we do. And so I'm happy to have those as part of the same conversation. And having digital trade in the conversation reminds us all that the internet is a global thing, and that there is a lot of commerce that depends on data flowing back and forth between these two regions. And so, yeah, I'm happy that that's the way the conversation seems to be moving, and hope that they kind of stick together.
I would add maybe just one point on, which is whether we bundle digital trade with or digital policy with other issues, who knows, right? I mean, all of them answer to different type of factors and influencers. But I think it's increasingly clear that you cannot isolate digital trade from the issues, and be they supply chain issues, be they responsibilities of other sectors. Again, it's partitioning digital trade from other sectors that are increasingly relying on the ability to move data, the ability to access the technology that they need to operate. This would probably turn into some of those unintended consequences that we mentioned earlier. I think it's something like 75% of data flows today, of that value of data flows, actually accrues to traditional industries. So it's manufacturing, it's logistics, it's those sectors that are reliant on the ability to move data across the countries, as much as you would think about digital players. And so I think taking digital trade in isolation of those types of realities is not a good way forward. So I think that having that intersections in the conversations might be important to, again, avoid unintended consequences and just take the measure of what is really at stake here, again, in terms of recovery, sustainability, and all those other issues that are underpinned increasingly by digital trade.
Yeah, I see the convergence there, absolutely. And in fact, there might be an argument to even pull in, national security and surveillance discussions at the same time, right? We're seeing digital trade so disrupted by national security policies around the world that maybe what you really need to do is continue the very broad dialogues while at the same time breaking things up. We are approaching the end of our session today. We have not talked about content moderation at all yet. I am sorry, everyone. I know that you were all waiting to hear about Trump, but does anyone have any thoughts about how the DSA is progressing and how, Section 230 or any convergence between U.S. rules and European proposals may fit together or not for the year. Lightning round. Christian, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there's very different, we have shared values, but there's a very different emphasis on free speech in the US that we do not have in Europe, right? So I think as much as we would like to see converging rules, I don't think we'll ever have the same rules between the EU and the US. I'm not even sure we're going to have one set of rules in the EU. Everybody talks about having one EU digital single market. But what are you seeing on content moderation? We have the Digital Services Act, the DSA. Well, at the same time, you have countries like France who are rushing ahead with their national versions of it. So, if Europe could come up with their own EU versions, then we could start talking about maybe some transatlantic conversions. That said, I do think that it is much better to have one EU-wide Digital Services Act, that could help create a better functioning EU digital single market and, provide clarity on everybody's responsibility. And of course, very importantly, safeguard online rights.
Alec, any last thoughts on content moderation?
Yeah, I'll pull the technological Hail Mary, which I think is that a solution here might come not from policy, but from technological innovation at the protocol layer of the internet. And so I'm just very influenced by Mike Masnick's article for the paper for the Knight Foundation last year on protocols versus over platforms. And basically making the idea that the foundation of the internet, obviously taking off in the 90s, is based on protocols. It's based on, think of email protocols that allow you function. And there are platforms like Gmail and like Yahoo Mail and like others, Outlook, Microsoft Outlook, that are built on top of the email protocols. But what if more of the platforms we currently use were built on open protocols and then platforms sat further up the stack on top of them? Maybe we could get less conflict or disagreement on these issues, because then more of the content that's so controversial could live in the protocol layer, and then different countries with different platforms could pull different kinds of content or have different rules about moderation. Maybe you could get kind of let 1,000 flowers bloom in that sense, instead of having one dominant global player with control of just the full platform, but having more of that in the protocol stack that is open, accessible, not controlled by any one corporation or a single entity. I think I'd just love to see more innovation like we saw in the early days of the internet in terms of building functionality into the protocol layer of the internet.
Thank you, Alec. Isabel, would you like to make a last point on 230, or would you like to be saved by the bell on this one?
Well, I think the DSA is an interesting proposal. I think what's interesting is that it really builds on some of the elements that have worked well in the e-commerce directive, which was in place, I think, since 2000. The intermediary liability is a good example of that. I think content moderation in the B2B space is not articulated the same way as for others on local and so in the more consumer-facing side of things. So our equities will be perhaps on, I think, calling for more clarity on some of the concepts that are in the DSA, like dissemination to the public, what exactly is meant by this type of thing. But that's a general note, perhaps, and I can end on that. I think, again, the definition of the problem and understanding what are the terms that are used, and making sure that we all have a common understanding of what that means. And that's true for sort of concepts in a legislation as much as policy concepts like open digital sovereignty, for example. I think we're still waiting to see how those concepts evolve. But again, it's going to be important for any organization that are going to have to apply those rules, that they're clear on their responsibilities depending on where they are in the ecosystem and their role and responsibilities. So I'll leave it at that for the DSA part.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Christian, Alec, Isabel, thank you very much for your time today. Everyone in the audience, thank you for joining us. Special thank you to Access Partnership for hosting this. I'm Andy Hyman from Monument Advocacy. Thanks, everybody, and look forward to staying in touch.